Hello, I'm Stuart Bowes, and you're watching or listening to the Net Hero podcast. This is a podcast for you if you care about what we're doing to the planet. You don't have to be an eco-warrior. We believe business is the solution to making things better. But we're for people who want to make that difference by either cutting their emissions or coming up with ideas that can help us do things a bit better. We've featured politicians, academics, lots and lots of business people, entrepreneurs, inventors, and of course people who are just interested in doing the right thing. So sit back, listen and enjoy, and make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Please share it with your friends and colleagues, and you can always check out our two websites that cover all of this, Energy Live News and futurenetzero.com. This podcast is purely editorial, so sit back and enjoy this week's episode. We're going to clean up our streets, and that's what's happening around the world, particularly in Western countries. We're moving to EVs. But one of the things that probably started all of this is catalytic converters. You know, the way that we used to clean up smog was using these catalytic converters, which probably, if you've had this experience like I have, people try and nick them. But they contain lots of rare earth elements. One of the things that's happening as we transition to cleaner transport in particular, but just generally cleaner technologies, is there'll be much more demand for these sort of things. So how will we, A, ensure that we're not taking more stuff out the ground? And B, could we be recycling these materials much more right now to create a nice reserve of these materials that can be used again and again in that ideal term of circularity? Well, my guest on the podcast this week is a man who's been looking at all of this and has a business that's been looking at recycling all these rare earth elements. Don Weatherbee, who is from Canada. How are you, Don?
I'm doing really well.
And he's tariff-free for now, aren't you, Don?
Yes, we are at this moment.
So you run a company called Regenx Tech. Briefly, for our audience, just explain what you do in a nutshell.
So what we do is we take used catalytic converters and we strip out platinum group metals, specifically platinum and palladium, for reuse in the economy.
And this stuff, I said it in the intro just then, people might not know, but you know, the history of this catalytic converter, maybe it's worth going into that. They were probably, I think we were talking just before we started recording, you said they were kind of the first step towards net zero. For people who are probably too young to know about them, why were they brought in and what do they do?
So late 70s, early 80s, one of the biggest issues around, especially in cities, was smog. And, you know, people of a certain age can remember, you know, you'd go outside and that was just thick, ugly, hung over the city. And that smog was, you know, your noxious gases coming out of automobiles. And the first way to combat this was a catalytic converter. And so how a catalytic converter works, just for a quick piece, is that it looks like a muffler under your car. But inside that steel container is a honeycomb with all kinds of pores and holes in that. And that honeycomb is coated with platinum and palladium, PGM materials. And as the dirty air flows across it, it creates a chemical reaction. And then it takes the noxious gas and converts them into less harmful, effectively into CO2. And that's what's emitted. And at the time, that was thought to be a great advance because we were just putting into the air more of what we had in the air, and we were taking away these harmful gases and they did a great job. I mean, people today don't understand how bad that smog was in cities.
You and I are the same vintage. I remember it very well. Streets, particularly in the winter in London, you know, walk into school and you could just see the smog from the thing is, I remember them definitely I don't remember them much in the 70s. I remember them sort of really from the 80s in the UK. I think America was slightly ahead of us. But if you look at it, the thing was, we were very much lead petrol. I don't know if that was the same in
Yes,
Canada
yes.
and the US. And so no one really thought about CO2. Everyone thought about you could smell it, you could hear it, like you say, you could taste it, the sort of particulates. Is that what catalytic converters did? It basically absorbed the dirty bits of lead and the nitrous oxides, and so that, in a way, was a massive cleanup.
Yeah, I mean, on the technical side, it didn't absorb it, it converted it. It
Right.
changed the structure so it converted it into from one type, a harmful gas, into a less harmful type formula. But that
What
was what its role was.
what percentage of cars still have them these days?
Every car, every engine pretty much now has a catalytic converter.
Right.
So regulations started with your family auto, which was the simplest one to do.
Yeah.
And it's moved gradually more and more into the diesel market, and then it went into um, stationary, so that any engine effectively today now has a catalytic converter on it. So even things like marine and your yellow iron, the big Caterpillar trucks and all that, they
Yeah,
all
yeah.
have catalytic converters on them too now, which they didn't in the 80s. That so
The palladium and the platinum, all these things. Why were they put in the first place?
so what they do is they sit there and they allow that chemical reaction, the conversion process to happen. So
Right.
they're an oxidizer type thing, so that as the air flows over top of these metals, it allows them to convert what the actual form of the gases become.
But it's ironic that they had to be precious metals.
It's like everything, you know. If it's going to do something good, it's precious.
It's precious, yeah. And then obviously, I mean, we were talking again just before we started recording. It has calmed down a little bit, but it still goes on. A spate of people going under cars, stealing the catalytic converters to basically sell the scrap for those precious metals, isn't it? It's a big industry.
Yeah, I mean, you heard a rash of it, and it was a fairly substantial issue. It's come down at least a lot in North America,
Hmm.
partly because industry has worked in conjunction with government and have implemented programs. One of the specific ones is uh, KYC, know your customer. So you have to be able to prove providence of your materials now.
Gotcha.
And so even ourselves, we
Yeah.
had to turn back a lot because they couldn't prove where it was coming from. So that's we've been pushing the from the buy side
Yeah.
down to the criminal element, saying we're going to try to take away your market so that you
Yeah.
can't sell. And so now most of your stealing is ones and twos who are trying to melt them down in their backyards type thing.
No, not a good thing.
No.
What is in the catalytic converter? What can be saved? So you explained the honeycomb, you explained all of that. I assume it sits in a sort of steel box or whatever. So let's go through how you'd recycle this sort of stuff right now.
Yeah, so we work in conjunction with a major scrap dealer and who actually got us into this industry because we were in a processing type uh,
Right,
business, and he asked if we could work with catalytic converters. And so what he collects them and
right.
then he decans them. So he takes the honeycomb out of the steel case,
Yeah,
then grinds it down into a fine powder. And so the ones we specialize in, that honeycomb is a silicon carbide material.
right.
So a fancy ceramic.
Okay.
And so that ceramic is coated with the precious metals. And so when he breaks it down into the powder, we can then put it into what's called the hydrometallurgical process.
Whoa.
Fancy word for a chemical leach. So
Okay.
we use chemistry to extract the precious metals off of the ceramic material. So once we do that, it's put into a solution. We then separate out the solids, the the ceramics, and then we have these precious metals sitting in a solution, a pregnant leach solution for ourselves. Then we take that leach solution and we use another chemical reaction that drops the precious metals back into a solid form, which
Right.
is what we call a dirty concentrate. And we provide that dirty concentrate to a refiner who who creates it into a 99.9% pure metal. So we like to say, and it sort of tags with our name, is that we're not like a traditional recycler that where your product is a downgrade.
Yeah.
An example I give is white paper.
Yeah.
You give white paper, you put it in the recycle bin, it's never coming back as white paper.
No,
It's
no.
coming back as a brown cardboard or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you most times recycling downgrades your product as you're going. We actually regenerate the precious metal to the exact form it was as it came out of the ground.
Wow. So, as a percentage in a catalytic converter,
Yeah.
let's give it a percentage. Let's say 100% is the original amount of palladium or whatever's in it. How much of that 100 units, let's call it, would you be able to recycle, do you think?
We're above 99 90 sorry, we're above 97%.
Wow. So,
Yeah.
the question that people would say is, sounds great, Don, but what about all the crap that comes with making this stuff? You know, you have to recycle it, so that must be energy. You talk about chemicals, there'll be a big footprint with that. So, are you doing lots of harm while you're trying to do good?
Yeah, so fundamentally we're very low emission. And especially when you compare against mining. So if you look at mining, which is really your only other source, we're under 99% of all of the factors of those: water use, energy use, CO2 emissions, all that. And why is because we're using relatively small amounts. We only heat to about 80 to 90 degrees Celsius.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's not even getting something to boiling.
Ah,
So the energy used to get something, if you think about how small the energy is to get your tea kettle to go,
yeah.
well, we're not even bringing it to boil. So
Ah.
so that's where our energy use is quite a bit less. So
And this stuff that you get back, you say you send it somewhere in the refinery. Where does it go then? Does it just go back into industry in many uses?
yeah, so I mean, where I said fundamentally is we regenerate. We create a product that is exactly the same as it was before it was put into anything, into any catalytic converter. So the majority right now gets returned to catalytic converters themselves. So it's truly a circular industry here.
We're all about net zero. That's why you're on this podcast. Now, part of that move to net zero is EVs, obviously. People want to get rid of ICE engines, and so you won't need a catalytic converter in the future. So, what are you doing that would help us in the energy transport transition? Because people would say, well, that's great, but that's kind of a dying technology, isn't it? There's no need for it. Now, the
Yeah.
truth, we've got millions of cars that are going to be around for quite a while. So let's tackle that first. Before we talk about what you will do as cars sort of come off, what does the market in the future hold? Because EVs do have precious metals and precious materials. They don't have the catalytic converters, do they?
No, they don't have a catalytic converter. They don't need it because you're not burning the gasoline, which is creating the gases. But there are there is a whole host of technologies that are dependent on PGMs, and
Right,
this is the hydrogen economy.
right.
So, and fundamentally, your EVs are built around two baselines. One is your battery electric, and your other is your fuel cells.
Yeah,
And your fuel cells are hydrogen based. And so, a hydrogen economy, the two sides of the hydrogen economy need um, platinum. The one is the electrolysis side, which is the creation of green hydrogen. And
yeah.
the second is a hydrogen fuel cell. So in the reaction where you put hydrogen in, you have to have a place where that reaction occurs, and that anode is platinum based.
Wow.
So there, there's actually predicted to be more demand for platinum in the future than
Yeah.
there is currently based on catalytic converters. So,
And this is the crux of it, isn't it? I mean, this is when people say, oh, they're all cleaner, green, and I've got an EV myself. I always think, well, hang on a second, because we are, let's look at what's going on globally, politically. Why does Mr. Trumpy want to get the minerals out of Ukraine? Why does he want to go to Greenland? We know what's going on in China. We know what's going on around the world. People are looking for resources where there's palladium and lithium and platinum and all these rare metals. That is a criticism that the EV industry will bring more demand on mining and more demand on bringing stuff out. Do you think your technology can play a role in trying to reduce that by using this kind of recycled, as you said, regenerated raw
well,
materials?
well, fundamentally, I'll put it in this piece, is that there isn't enough mining right now to meet current demand.
Yeah,
So the statistics show, so over the last 8 years, there has been a deficit of supply of platinum and palladium of over 259,000 ounces annually.
right.
So we're already below the level that can be sustainable without increased recycling. And to count on more mining is really,
That's the
a
worst thing to
fool's
do. Yeah.
worst thing to do. And even
Mm.
if it wasn't, it's a fool's errand because there just isn't a lot more mines to be able to go into. So that whole reuse recycling component is the only way the future is demand's going to be met. So
And
we have to keep looking at ways to do that.
yeah, and in terms of these, platinum, what do you call them? Platinum group metals, PGM, yeah?
Yes.
Apart from the catalytic converters, I mean, are they in, I don't know, my phone or the computer we're talking on? Could we get them from other things that we've built, other sort of technologies?
Well, the majority of them right now, the majority of palladium goes into catalytic converters.
Right.
Platinum is a little bit more diverse.
Yes.
Um, but there is also two sides to a catalytic converter market. There's the auto side, then there's a smokestack, the
Okay.
industrial side.
Right.
There is, like I said, is most things that emit gases
Of course,
go
yeah.
through catalytic converters. So the majority of times, if you see a smokestack, it has a catalytic converter on it on an industrial scale.
Got you. So there's plenty more of this out there.
And plenty more demand too, because of the increased regulations on what you can just let go out of a smokestack.
Where do you see your company being in the next 10 years? Do you see yourselves moving into recycling EVs? Do you see that happening? Or what do you think you'll do?
Well, our first part would be sort of growing what we do, and
Right.
then looking at saying, okay, is there any other minerals, metals, types of things that we could do, um, in the technical term, becoming a secondary refiner
Right.
to be able to extract precious metals from other sources. So we're working on those and seeing how we could fit into that. But there is a huge amount of the catalytic converter, the auto market, that
Yeah.
is going to eat up our bandwidth and ability. Um,
Yeah, it's true. I
the
mean,
biggest,
we won't have a ban for another maybe 5 years, could be more, but those cars will live, 10, 15 years, won't they? So this,
yeah. So where we talk to people of saying, okay, yeah, it's one thing to say the EVs have come,
yeah,
uh, but you've got to, we don't see the product until you've end of life of the car, which 10 to 15 years after it's been bought.
true.
So the EVs are not going to, the ICE engines aren't just going to be dropped. Your 2 year old your 2 year old Volvo
Yeah,
isn't going to be scrapped. It's
no.
going to live its
Yeah,
life before it's converted.
I just looked up while we were talking. 94 million cars around the world. I think you'll be all right, actually. Don't.
Well, and like I said, we specialize a little bit in the diesel side.
Yeah.
Because there's a slight different structure in the honeycomb that's an advantage to us. And diesel is your more heavy duty, and it's the slower conversion process than the autos. I mean, the when you're talking about converting your heavy haul trucks, they're they're not coming off the line right away here.
Yeah. Before we go, I mean, this whole thing, and I've had people like you on before, and I like it because I do believe that all the solutions we've had really lately have been build more, right? So build wind farms, build nuclear power stations, build things. And there's all that stuff that's very precious sitting in things we've already made. Do you think, just to conclude, the sector you're in, the whole recycling, reusing, whatever you want to call it, that actually has such a big role to play in
Yeah.
this zero thing? Because most of the talk is let's make new EVs, let's make new power stations, let's build new infrastructure. And I go back to the fact that, well, all that stuff has to come from raw materials and it all still comes from the ground. Globally, I don't see enough talk about this. And I don't know whether you think governments have just not, it's easier, isn't it? Say, I'm going to build something nice and shiny and new.
Yeah, well, we've talked to a few people, and we're the dirty little secret of recycling. We're the
Yeah.
gritty side of recycling. Everybody likes to think about how the net green is the pretty windmill and all the stuff you build, like you're saying, but it comes back to raw materials. And to get raw materials, it's not pretty.
No, it's
It's
digging
never
up.
pretty.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's logistics. It's supply chains. It's the nuts and bolts of how you do something, and it's not the sexy thing to put your stamp on. But here's a term for you that is sort of a better way of looking at it, and it's urban mining.
Yeah. Okay.
And so it's about finding the precious materials in the current environment,
I
which
like it.
and we look at a lot of the urban mining stuff, like I said earlier, it's the only time you truly regenerate the product. Because with the metals, you can bring it back to the original, unlike so many different parts. And you can create these pieces that can be anything that they were originally meant for. And you don't have to find new ways of doing it. I mean, most recycling, uh, tires. You're trying to find new ways to use these things for playgrounds or whatever. So you have to be inventive. For urban mining, it's not finding a new use. It's reusing, it's regenerating, it is actually um, creating it again.
I think that's an amazing thought. I think it's a brilliant way to end this chat. I love it. Urban mining. I shall get the t-shirt now, Don. I think what you're doing is really, really clever. Thank you so much for sharing it with our audience. Regenx, ladies and gents, that's the company. And Don, I think you definitely, hopefully, you're running a successful business. I hope this thing picks up. And just as a quick last thought, is it something that you're seeing in other parts of the world? Because I always wonder about this being very much kind of a first world thing, but are people doing this in sort of developing nations where there's so much pollution, where there's so much of the climate change issue?
In our specific one, there's a part that is our niche is new
Yeah,
that we're doing, but there is that concept of urban mining is being moved out across the world, especially into more developing areas.
yeah, I think it's brilliant. Don, thank you for getting up early.
My pleasure.
Thanks very much for joining us on the Net Hero podcast. Ladies and gents, thank you for listening and watching. Tell us what you think about urban mining. Get in touch on social media. We'll be back with an episode very, very soon. My thanks to Rob for the production this week. Catch you on the next one.
You've just heard the Net Hero podcast from futurenetzero.com. Join us as we help you find ways to cut your carbon footprint as we head towards net zero. Subscribe and follow us on social media. futurenetzero.com. Better business, better planet.